Aura. To some, she was the so-called communist mayor. To others, she was Dante's successor, wielding overpowered perks to secure favor in the community. But Aura's legacy wasn't built on communism or perks alone. What began as a clever political system, the minister elections quickly became the engine that kept Aura in power. And for a time, it worked. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming and the system was exploited by the very people it was designed to control. In just 9 minister elections, the system that kept Aura in power would ultimately become her downfall, causing players to lose confidence in the system and to question whether she overstayed her welcome. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain, exposing what really happened during the minister elections and how SkyBlock's voting system failed the player base and brought out the worst in the community. This is the rise and fall of Aura. It was a quiet, ordinary day in SkyBlock. I had just logged into SkyBlock to cycle out the Forge and to complete a few things before Thanksgiving break. The election booth had just opened, so I decided to cast my vote for the next mayor before I left for a few days. When I arrived at the hub, that's when I saw it. There was a new candidate on the ballot who was running on these perks. Despite this candidate wearing a plague doctor skin and giving off evil supervillain vibes, there was something eerily familiar about Aura, and it wasn't just the similarities to Dante. I felt like I've seen Aura before and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So I went to the Hypixel wiki and lo and behold, I found my answer. Prior to appearing as a candidate for mayor, Aura was an NPC on the Crimson Isle. Hidden in a cave inside the Magma Boss chamber is this room known as Aura's laboratory. Aura was once here and had this dialogue indicating that she had an evil plan that would come into fruition in just a few years. Fast forward to today, it was clear that Aura was evil and had a hidden agenda. Fearing another Dante takeover, I cast my vote for Paul and went on my way. A short time later, players quickly discovered what Aura's hidden perks were by viewing the Hypixel API. As it would turn out, Aura was offering a mixed bag of perks, some really strong, others not so much. Free coins and more magic find were enough for many players to overlook higher taxes, slower minions, and increased mob HP. However, the real deciding factor was Aura's perk, Work Smarter, which granted a 50% boost to skill XP. Just weeks earlier, the Hypixel team had announced the Community Celebration event, giving all SkyBlock players a 30% skill XP multiplier from the time of the post through the end of the year. Stacking that bonus with Aura's 50% skill XP boost all but guaranteed Aura's victory in the election. On November 28th, the inevitable happened. In a landslide victory and setting a record for most votes received in SkyBlock history, Aura became mayor of SkyBlock and thus began her 51-day reign. One hour after Aura took office as the mayor of SkyBlock, something unexpected happened. The minister election booth opened, allowing players to vote SkyBlock players in as ministers. The last time players were able to vote for ministers was during Dante's reign, when the community rallied behind Technoblade as the resistance leader to overthrow Dante and restore SkyBlock to its former state. At first, I thought history was repeating itself, that this was another moment where we as the SkyBlock players would choose representatives to rise up against Aura. However, as time went on, it became clear that this election was very different. This election wasn't about forming a resistance or overthrowing Aura. It was about Aura allowing players to serve in her cabinet, granting them the ability to add additional mayor perks to SkyBlock, alongside the ones she already had active. With this being the very first minister election, the process was somewhat experimental, with rules not fully established until the third election. With that said, the first election unfolded as one might expect. By large, it was a popularity contest, and the results weren't even close. The following players were elected as the first round of SkyBlock ministers, with 6 of the 7 ministers having a YouTube rank. As a reward for finishing in the top 3, 30 Virus, Mr. Faceplate, and Future 77 were granted the opportunity to introduce a custom perk to SkyBlock. This reward established the precedent for future minister elections, becoming the prize for the top 3 candidates in all subsequent elections. Within 48 hours of being elected, the top 3 ministers had their custom perk added to SkyBlock. 30 Virus introduced the precursor drone pet. Mr. Faceplate, also known as Technodad, added upgrades to the potato talisman and the blood god crest. And Future 77 implemented a new drop from Kudra, the Kudra Tentacle, which could be used to craft an entirely new accessory line. This would be the only time custom perks were implemented while Aura was mayor, as the admins decided to delay adding subsequent custom perks until after the Aura event concluded. As far as the regular perks, this is what each minister chose. Wait, what? In a move that stunned the entire community, I'm a Squid Kid chose to remove Aura's perk, Minion Union, from the game. Branded a traitor for the decision, Squid Kid was promptly thrown in jail by Aura and was replaced with an election goon. Despite Aura's fury, Squid Kid's removal of Minion Union was largely met with community support, as the perk was widely regarded as Aura's worst. With Aura's reign overlapping with December's bingo, the removal of this perk also prevented what would have been an almost impossible challenge for bingo players, as minions are crucial to bingo players, and 4 of December's bingo objectives required collection-based tasks. Support for Squid Kid continued to grow, as Aura was throwing players in jail for typing /kill Aura, left-clicking on goons, and for saying anything negative about her in the chat. While jail sentences for these infractions typically lasted only 5 minutes, Squid Kid remained trapped, quickly earning the sympathy and support of the community. A short time later, the community banded together to break Squid Kid out of jail using a rusty spoon, an item purchasable from an NPC hidden in the hexed basement. On December 4th, Squid Kid was finally free, but not without consequences. Aura would permanently ban Squid Kid from ever running as a minister again. As the second minister election approached, a new rule came into focus. Elected ministers were barred from serving consecutive terms, though they could run again after sitting out for 1 SkyBlock year. This rule opened the door for lesser-known creators to step into the race and compete for a minister spot. Despite the new rule, 1 minister managed to find a loophole. Durelius, minister number 4 in the previous minister election, selected the perk Long-Term Investment, which guaranteed he could return as a candidate in the second minister election, giving him the rare opportunity to serve 2 consecutive terms. But Durelius' 500 IQ play wasn't the only bold move on the table. Mr. Faceplate chose the perk Voice of the People, which caused votes cast by sitting ministers to count as 5,000 votes each. As a result, each minister held an enormous voting advantage heading into the second minister election, enough to prop up any candidate they wished, and potentially deciding the outcome of the second minister election. Fortunately, 2NFG's chosen perk was experienced voters, which increased every player's vote from 1 to a value based on their fame rank. Whether calculated or completely coincidental, this decision shifted power back to the community, returning the election to the hands of the players. As the second minister election booth opened, one candidate shot up to the top of the leaderboard almost instantly, an emergence that could only be described as confusing? At first, players assumed the NPC Confused Goon was simply being voted in as minister, but something far more sinister was at play. As it would turn out, the Confused Goon on the election podium wasn't an NPC at all, but a mystery player from the SkyBlock community LARPing as one. Speculation exploded over the identity of this mystery player, and one name quickly rose above the rest. Although the name history of Confused Goon was hidden on NameMC.com, sleuths quickly matched Confused Goon's UUID to a known alt belonging to Squid Kid. Based on this discovery alone, it was widely believed that Squid Kid renamed his alt, used code SQUID, to Confused Goon, and used his Voice of the People vote at the very start of the second minister election to catapult Confused Goon to the top of the leaderboard. Many speculated that Mr. Faceplate had also cast his Voice of the People vote for Confused Goon, given that the two had endorsed each other in the first election, though this was never confirmed. With Confused Goon now front and center in the second minister election, players continued voting, many under the false assumption that they were supporting the NPC, not the player in disguise. Meanwhile, content creator Blockit James hosted what would become the first of many minister debates. Confused Goon was among the candidates participating in the second minister election debate, though the player behind the candidate used a voice changer to keep their identity concealed.
Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here. My plans are to bring SkyBlock back to its former glory. Thank you.
During the debate, fellow candidates quickly put Confused Goon on the hot seat.
Say that again.
What are you going to do about it? Level 0?
This.
You haven't even played this game.
Terrible.
You're winning an election and you haven't even played the game. You haven't even played the game at all.
And
you're an actual bozo, buddy. You're a bozo. And you just won't admit it.
This is an ad hominem attack. And this man is
right. You're right. I think the next person needs to move on. I think I've made my opinion clear.
You know, I gotta be honest, I'm a little worried because I'm looking at this guy and I see someone who wants to take down everything Aura has built. And at the end of the day, Aura has only built this for the people, and the people are the only thing that matters. So if you come after the people, I promise I'll come after you.
Despite widespread efforts to derail Confused Goon's campaign, the second minister election came to a close, with Confused Goon finishing in first place. And with that, the newly elected ministers would be as follows. Notably, Durelius's power play paid off, making him the first and only minister to serve 2 consecutive terms. Also worth noting, Durelius's fiancée, Celestial Milk, secured a spot on the podium as the 7th minister. With the second minister elections concluded, some changes were made to the SkyBlock hub, notably the jail. Because the community freed Squid Kid from jail, the jail itself was broken, and for a time, no one could be locked up. The jail was repaired, and this time it was made from iron. To make matters worse, it was possible to glitch out of jail by using a horse pet, but now, pet spawning was disabled in the jail, forcing players to serve the full 5-minute sentence. As for the newly elected ministers, this was their chosen perks. And here we go again. In a move that shocked the entire community, Confused Goon forfeited their custom perk to remove Aura's second bad perk, Work Harder, which made monsters deal 10% more damage and have 10% more health. This move landed Confused Goon straight in jail, but this time, Aura handed the community a choice. Players could vote to free Confused Goon, or vote no and receive +5 Magic Find instead. The community chose Magic Find, and it wasn't even close. With that, Confused Goon served out the remainder of his sentence in jail, becoming the last minister to be jailed until the 8th minister election. With Minion Union and Work Harder gone, Aura effectively became the most overpowered mayor SkyBlock had ever seen, and the event slipped into a period of stagnation that would last for several weeks. As the 3rd minister election booth opened, it marked the beginning of a new era, one defined by stricter rules that would govern every election moving forward. Because Durelius had previously managed to serve consecutive terms, the perk long-term investment was removed entirely from the minister perk pool. Under the new system, the first place minister would select 3 perks, the second place minister 2, and the remaining 5 ministers 1 perk each. The top 3 ministers would still earn the opportunity to include a custom perk to SkyBlock once the Aura event concluded. However, in the interest of fairness, and to ensure other players had the opportunity to contribute a custom perk to SkyBlock, any minister who placed in the top 3 would become permanently ineligible to run in future minister elections. But for now, the 3rd minister election carried on and ended with these candidates being elected. I wish there was more to say about the 3rd minister election. By every measure, it was the fairest and cleanest minister election SkyBlock would ever see. No alt shenanigans, no rigging, and no controversy. Yet, it was only a matter of time before controversy came knocking. As the 4th minister election approached, Candy Pat, Lejimbo, and Celestial Milk, who had placed 5th through 7th in the 2nd minister election, became eligible to run again. Durelius, who finished 4th in the 2nd minister election, would have technically been eligible to run again in the 4th election. However, he was granted a custom perk due to his selection of long-term investment during his first term. The wording of the perk implied that he would return with all of his perks intact. While this interpretation was admittedly a stretch, the admins ultimately ruled in his favor, awarding him the custom perk at the cost of his eligibility to run again. As a result, Durelius became the first and only candidate to receive a custom perk on a technicality without ever placing in the top 3. The election booth opened, and it was a hotly contested election. However, the following candidates ended up winning the 4th minister election. All 3 eligible ministers from the 2nd election would return for the 2nd time as ministers. All seemed fine until it was time for the ministers to select their perks from the pool of minister perks. In a move that sent shockwaves throughout the entire community, Candy Pat selected a perk never seen before. This perk required every player to check in with surveillance goons every 30 minutes or suffer a 10% stat debuff. It didn't matter what you were doing, Kudra, dungeons, farming, slayers. Every 30 minutes, you had to drop everything to report in or pay the price. Public surveillance was met with immediate and intense backlash from the community. More troubling news followed. Rumors that Candy Pat had been doxxed and was receiving death threats. This situation was quickly spinning out of control and warranted serious attention from the Hypixel admins. Not long after the perk was selected, the admins quietly removed public surveillance, replacing it with another. Candy Pat later addressed the situation publicly, admitting that one motivating factor behind the perk choice was a hidden magic find bonus he received for selecting it. He emphasized that no harm was intended and that the decision was meant to be taken in good fun. Unfortunately, the backlash to public surveillance marked a dark moment for the SkyBlock community, one that would rear its ugly head several more times in the weeks ahead. After receiving a major endorsement from Dorelius, Alawi quickly emerged as the clear frontrunner in the 5th election. Alawi ran his campaign on a bold promise. He would sacrifice his own custom perk so that the other 6 ministers could each receive one instead. Although the admins ultimately rejected this proposal, the idea strongly resonated with the community. Alawi received a lot of support. However, some voters ran into an unexpected spelling issue at the polls. Some voters struggled with the spelling of Alawi's name and inadvertently cast their votes for an entirely different player with a similar name. With many players omitting the extra I, the unintended Alawi suddenly emerged as a legitimate contender. As the 5th minister election was nearing completion, one candidate will go on to pull off one of the greatest last-minute comebacks in SkyBlock history. Sitting in 9th place with just 3 hours remaining, Ascent PvP surged in the polls and ultimately finished 7th, narrowly edging out Rimbuck by a mere 69 votes. The 5th minister elections concluded with the following winners. Notably, Toadstar and Inther would return as ministers for the 2nd time, securing spots in the top 3. Shortly after the 5th minister election concluded, questions began to surface about how Ascent PvP had managed such a dramatic comeback. The admins believed the situation warranted a closer look. Upon investigation, it was discovered that an MVP++ giveaway was promoted during the final 30 minutes of the election.
Go to all the Bedwars lobby. I'll say go to SkyBlock and Photosphere PvP if you want a free rank giveaway.
In light of these findings, the admins made the decision to disqualify Ascent PvP and elevated Rimbuck as the 7th minister in place of Ascent PvP. And with those turn of events, these players would be the newly elected ministers. The fake Alawi who was elected due to a spelling error turned out to be an inactive player. As a result, the admins assigned him the perk Speak the Truth, which rewarded players with 10,000 coins for typing Aura Best in chat once every hour. While Speak the Truth was popular among many players, the most notable perk selection came from Minister number 6. Nightlibra selected the infamous perk Voice of the People, the same perk selected by Mr. Faceplate in the first election that Squid Kid would use to boost Confused Goon in the 2nd minister election. With the 6th minister election just around the corner, it was only a matter of time before history would repeat itself. The 6th minister election would turn out to be the most bizarre minister election. While it wasn't the most exciting, it stood out for 2 reasons. It was the first time that not a single YouTube ranked candidate finished in the top 5. Aside from the first minister election, it would also be the first and only time that every minister was newly elected and wasn't a returning minister. The man behind the minister debates, Blockit James, created an impressive website that tracked all 9 minister elections using data pulled directly from the Hypixel API. For each election, the votes were plotted on a graph, revealing voting patterns and historical trends over time. In an election where votes are tallied as they're cast, graphs should display a natural upward curve along the y-axis, as seen in the 5th minister election. What made the minister elections unique, however, was that players were allowed to change their vote to another candidate at any point while the election booth remained open. As a result, it's normal to see occasional declines on the y-axis for certain candidates. But when examining the voter analytics from the 6th minister election, the data tells a very different story. The patterns are highly unusual, pointing to only one plausible explanation: election rigging. Data showing drastic spikes like those seen here suggest that Voice of the People played a significant role in determining the outcome of the 6th minister election. To better understand what happened, I reached out to the minister who selected Voice of the People for a sit-down interview.
Originally, I wanted to wait to see what the perk list was to hopefully find a perk that hasn't been picked yet. When I was sent the perk list a couple hours before the election ended, originally I wanted to pick, I believe it's Speak the Truth, because that was the only one that we hadn't seen at that point. But then, when I saw Voice of the People, I knew what I had to do in terms of backup plans if Alawi's custom perk of letting all 7 ministers have a custom perk failed. So I asked Jaya what the outcome of that was. He said it wasn't happening, and that is why I had to choose my backup plan of Voice of the People in order to rig the next election.
During our Q&A, Nightlibra explained how Voice of the People shaped the 6th minister election, setting off what is arguably one of the strangest chain of events to date. The story unfolds as follows. Nightlibra campaigned on a custom perk that would introduce a secret bingo. When he failed to place in the top 3, he struck a deal with Ari the Monkey, the player who was famous for getting Barry elected as mayor, which ultimately brought the rift to SkyBlock. No stranger to election rigging, Ari the Monkey agreed to pick up Secret Bingo in exchange for Nightlibra's vote, a classic quid pro quo. Rimbuk Quaglet, who believed Ascent's disqualification in the previous election was unjust, initially voted for Ascent PvP in an effort to push him onto the podium. Meanwhile, Toadstar cast his vote for Luaman, and Enther voted for F-22 Raptor. As election rigging was taking place, Alawi wanted no part in rigging the next election, so he decided to hold his vote for now. Meanwhile, Squid Kid reached out to the ministers asking them to boost his brother, Shady Oak. As you may recall from the second minister debate, Yikes had unresolved tension with Confused Goon. When Squid Kid asked the ministers to vote for Shady Oak, Yikes devised an evil but genius plan. Yikes used Voice of the People on Shady Oak to lull Squid Kid into a false sense of security, only to switch his vote at the last minute to Knoqc, who was a close friend. With that, Yikes made good on his promise.
I promise you, I will come for you.
But Yikes wasn't the only player to make a last-minute change. Once Rimbuk Quaglet was confident that Ascent PvP would reach the podium without the extra 5,000 votes, he switched his vote to the frontrunner, Ari the Monkey. Alawi also waited until the final moments to decide, ultimately casting his vote for Luaman after determining that his choice would no longer affect the outcome of the election. This would be the elected ministers from the 6th election. The only candidates to reach the podium without any assistance from Voice of the People were Marina Footlover and Mash Clash. Knoqc, who reached the podium after a last-minute boost from Yikes, went to select a negative perk, triggering what many saw as a repeat of the Candy Pat effect. To no surprise, Knoqc's decision to implement 4x taxes sparked significant backlash from the community, yet the perk remained in place for the entirety of his term as minister. I wanted to find out why Knoqc chose this perk despite knowing what happened to Candy Pat. I also wanted to gauge the full extent of the backlash he faced. With these questions in mind, I reached out to Knoqc, who agreed to sit down for an interview.
So, I wanted to choose something unique. And I was like, what are some interesting perks? Like, what is something that other people wouldn't choose? And I remember, there's the derpy perks, where like he has like 2 good perks, 2 bad perks. And I was like, it'd be really funny if I chose 4x taxes. As for incentivize, if I was influenced or incentivized, whatever, no, not at all. I did this of my own volition because I thought it would be really funny.
Unfortunately, Knoqc received heavy criticism for choosing quad taxes.
it was absolutely met with a lot of criticism. I actually collected a bunch of screenshots of like death threats I received from people. There was people telling me to kill myself, to quit the game, to delete my profile, like, and even to this day, like on the daily, I'll join a lobby and somebody was like, "Knoqc, why did you choose Forex taxes?" And it's just like, it's funny. It did its job. People remember, and that was what I wanted it to do.
While the attention was fully on Knoqc, one minister's perk selection quietly went unnoticed, a perk that would ultimately break the system and lead to the fall of Aura. As the 7th minister election was approaching, players began to wonder how much longer the Aura event would last. The novelty was starting to wear off, and some players were wanting a shift in the status quo. Going into the 7th minister election, voting would be impacted by experienced voters, which had the potential to produce unpredictable results. When the election booth opened for the 7th time, a player with the Minecraft username God appeared out of nowhere and quickly dominated the 7th minister election leaderboards. With God at the forefront of the election, many players continued to boost the account, treating it as a joke. But what most didn't realize was that God wasn't even a real player, let alone a SkyBlock player. You see, the God account was once owned by an authentic player, but the account was stolen by hackers and was sold on the black market. Because the account was reported stolen, Mojang locked the account, and the account remains locked to this very day. As a reminder, the top 3 ministers are awarded with a custom perk. Since God was not owned or controlled by any player, the custom perk would essentially be voided if God finished in the top 3. Unfortunately, much of the SkyBlock community was unaware of this, and players continued to cast their votes for God. When the 7th minister election concluded, God would finish in first place, and these would be the elected ministers. The admins had previously prevented ministers from selecting Voice of the People in back-to-back elections. Now, however, Voice of the People was once again on the table. After a joke candidate won the previous election, one minister devised a clever solution to prevent another joke candidate from finishing in the top 3 and voiding yet another custom perk.
Yeah, so I tried arranging a new system, seeing God hit top, 1 was very demoralizing. We want actual perks in the game, we want updates, and we wanted to choose Voice of the People so that we would ensure that a joke candidate didn't get top 3 again. We kind of had to collude together to make sure that anything happened with that.
The plan was simple. ForagingMommy would select Voice of the People. If another joke candidate was projected to place in the top 3, the ministers would work together to manipulate the vote and push that candidate out, ensuring that real players would receive a custom perk instead. On paper, it was a brilliant strategy. However, in an effort to prevent election rigging and to avoid a repeat of the 6th minister election, the admins intervened. They assigned God the perk Experienced Voters, stripping the ministers of their ability to ultimately decide the outcome and returning control of the election to the player base. After God's election, some ministers viewed this as a mistake, believing that the previous election had already demonstrated that many players were either uninformed or no longer cared about the results of the election. One minister who appeared to have lost interest in the minister elections altogether was Minister number 4, MelonKingDe. Running on a custom perk that would have introduced a new collection to the Rift, Melon ran a strong campaign. However, Melon's campaign was derailed when God won the 7th minister election and pushed Melon out of the top 3. Feeling cheated and deeply frustrated by the entire situation, MelonKing became the 3rd minister to select a negative perk. The same perk previously chosen by Candy Pat that had sparked significant backlash from the community. Unfortunately, Melon would also receive similar treatment for selecting public surveillance. As the 8th minister election drew near, tensions ran high. and uncertainty loomed over its outcome. It would be the second time that both Voice of the People and experienced voters would be active at the same time, the last being the second minister election. To some extent, experienced voters can stop ministers from directly deciding elections. However, it does not stop ministers from boosting candidates at the start of an election, as seen with Confused Goon, which proved to be very effective. With the conditions aligned, history was bound to repeat itself, setting the stage for what would become the most chaotic and dramatic minister election in SkyBlock history. The 8th minister election began, and a new name suddenly appeared on top of the leaderboard. True to the name, the candidate campaigned on a single promise: ending Aura's reign. Little was known about End Aura, but it quickly became apparent that a sitting minister had boosted the candidate using Voice of the People. It was soon discovered that MelonKingDe, now firmly on a full-fledged villain arc, was the minister behind the boost. End Aura was an unknown player who was planning to run in the 10th election with the goal of bringing the Aura event to a close. Days before the 8th election, Melon befriended End Aura and saw an opportunity to stir things up. While Melon's true motives remained unclear, one thing was certain: many players were eager for the Aura event to reach its conclusion, as demonstrated by the significant traction that End Aura quickly gained. One minister who wasn't ready for the Aura event to end was ForagingMommy. ForagingMommy was the first sitting minister to notice End Aura's rapid ascent, and the concern was clear. Without a strong alternative candidate, End Aura would run away with the election and deliver exactly what their name promised. Realizing that the 8th minister election might very well be the last, ForagingMommy brought a plan to the Aura Council, and one former minister rose to the challenge.
We see somebody rising very quickly up the podium. Their name is End_Aura. And in our group chat, Zimri sends a message. They're like, hey, does anybody have an alt account they could change to like keep_Aura? And then it clicks in my head. I have an alt account that I'm borrowing from my sister. I immediately open up Mojang, or the website. I change my name to keep_Aura. And then ForagingMommy throws their 5,000 votes onto my alt account.
ForagingMommy's vote for Keep Aura effectively put Knoqc alt on the leaderboard and gave the community a choice between ending Aura or letting Aura stay. As a result, the election quickly transformed into a two-person race. Meanwhile, experienced voters once again introduced an element of chaos and unpredictability. Experienced voters was responsible for getting God elected, and with it active again, many players were once again inclined to vote for joke candidates, only this time with the assistance of a disgruntled minister. Amid the growing chaos, one joke candidate quickly gained traction and would surge into third place. Heading into the election, the ministers from the 7th round had hoped to avoid a repeat of a joke candidate being elected and voiding another custom perk. Instead, the 8th minister election spiraled beyond anyone's expectations. The top 3 positions were now at serious risk of being overtaken entirely by joke candidates. The damage had been done, and the only remaining option was for the ministers to rally their votes behind a real player to push Knoqc out and reclaim third place. Meanwhile, an intervention was taking place. While everyone understood MelonKing's frustrations and no one blamed him for being upset over losing his custom perk to God, it was clear that a line had been crossed. Melon ultimately apologized and shifted his vote back to his personal friend. In the final hours of the 8th minister election, Lejimbo, To Be Determined, ForagingMommy, and Aland each used Voice of the People on the 4th place candidate. The coordinated push was enough to propel Match Clash into the top 3, securing him a custom perk. With Knoqc out of the top 3, the ministers had successfully prevented another voided custom perk. And with that, the ministers for the 8th election were decided. Keep Aura won the election, with End Aura finishing in 2nd place. Despite Keep Aura's victory, the admins ruled that the 9th minister election would be the final one. Although Keep Aura was an alt account belonging to Knoqc, Keep Aura was permitted to retain a custom perk. However, the admins made it clear that Keep Aura's perk could not be used to cancel or override End Aura's perk, which was to end the Aura event. With Aura set to depart after the 9th minister election, the newly elected ministers agreed that the final election should be conducted fairly. To that end, none of them chose Voice of the People or experienced voters. With those restrictions in place, each minister selected their perks accordingly. One minister, however, chose to engage in a bit of trolling. SnowflakeKiwi decided to remove Aura's strongest perk, Work Smarter, which granted the community a 50% boost to skill, dungeon, and slayer XP. This marked the first time a sitting minister had deliberately removed one of Aura's good perks. As a result, SnowflakeKiwi was jailed and forced to serve the full sentence for the remainder of her term. The removal of Work Smarter would become one of the most controversial decisions ever made by a minister. I wanted to understand why SnowflakeKiwi made this choice, especially given her close ties to MelonKing. With these questions in mind, I reached out to her to request an interview.
I think removing a perk from Aura is something I always wanted to do to get Aura to end, because as much as I like Aura, and she's very helpful, she's also like, we had, 30% stacked on top of 50%? That was like 80%. It was insane. But one of the things is, like, my perk choice directly went against cheaters, and both me and Melon are very anti-cheat. So, like, it was a worthy sacrifice.
Although SnowflakeKiwi's removal of Work Smarter was partially offset by the perk More Skills, which the admins assigned to Knoqc, she still faced some of the worst backlash a sitting minister would face.
I've never had something like this have real-world consequences like that. I very much did get doxxed. At one point, the police did get involved because of the doxing. I kind of screenshotted all of that, and then I put it in a drive, and I gave it off to police, so whatever police do with it, that's their call.
Aura was meant to be an engaging, short-term event, but the growing misconduct made it clear that the event had run its course. Aura needed to go in order to restore normalcy. Fortunately, the end was finally in sight. The 9th and final minister election was approaching, and the community would have one last opportunity to elect real players who would bring meaningful custom perks to SkyBlock. For the first time since the 5th minister election, both Voice of the People and experienced voters were inactive. Without experienced voters, joke candidates would have a tougher time getting elected, though that didn't stop some players from trying. When the election booth opened, votes trickled in steadily until the leaderboard began to take shape. One joke candidate managed to climb onto the podium, exploiting the very weakness that plagued most of the minister elections: uninformed voters. Aura Stay continued to gain support from players who were unaware that the 9th minister election would be the final one, and that Aura would not be staying regardless of the results. Ultimately, Aura Stay would finish in 2nd place, and the following candidates were elected as ministers of the 9th election. Shortly after the 9th minister election concluded, it was revealed that Aura Stay was an alt account belonging to MelonKingDe. Many initially assumed that Melon and Kiwi were still trolling the community, but the reason for creating Aura Stay turned out to be surprisingly simple.
We wanted our perk. Honestly, that's probably the best way to put it. Joke candidates worked. They worked almost too well. We knew from End Aura that a joke candidate would work, and seeing the amount of people who actually wanted to keep Aura, Melon, the genius he is, was like, oh, we'll just run on a fake perk. If you can't beat them, join them.
Aland, the 1st place minister, reinstated Work Smarter. In contrast, Aura Stay, the 2nd place minister, chose to activate 2 negative perks. Aura Stay's decision to select negative perks, despite securing a top 3 finish, was puzzling to many, but Melon and Kiwi had their reasons. Shortly after the ministers selected their mayor perks, the admins issued a decision that was as shocking as it was contradictory. Melon King and SnowflakeKiwi intended to push their custom perk through Aura Stay, but the admins rejected the attempt. The ruling immediately raised questions of fairness. Knoqc, a former minister, had successfully secured a custom perk through his alt account Keep Aura, a move that admins had previously approved. Yet, when Melon King attempted a nearly identical approach, his custom perk was denied. While the explanation provided by the admins was understandable on its own, it clashed with their earlier decision. With their ruling, the Aura event ended on a sour note, leaving uncertainty over whether Aura would ever return. During the 9th minister debate, I was asked this question.
If you had the ability to make Aura a special mayor, what changes would you make?
If you were to ask me this question today, I would give a very different answer. First of all, the concept of Aura at its core was an excellent idea. SkyBlock has long needed a major event to recapture the magic of its glory days, and in many ways, Aura succeeded in doing just that. Where Aura ultimately fell short, however, was in its execution and planning. It became apparent early on that there was no clear exit strategy, which caused the event to lose momentum and feel increasingly stale in its final weeks. Another issue with the event was a lack of consistent communication and engagement with the broader community. While the Aura event had its share of flaws, the admins did get several things right. The system of awarding custom perks to winners was an excellent incentive and a major highlight of the event. Making past winners ineligible to run again gave small creators and ordinary players a shot at leaving their mark in the game. However, if Aura is to return, which it appears that she will, a lot will need to change with the system to ensure that the misconduct can never happen again. What could the admins do differently next time? For starters, I believe Aura should return during the summer, rather than at the end of the year around major holidays. This would allow more players to participate and fully enjoy the event. Several changes to the minister elections would also help improve fairness and engagement. First, long-term investment, voice of the people, and experienced voters should be removed from the perk pool to prevent election rigging and perk voiding. Secondly, alt accounts and joke candidates should be ineligible to run. Eligibility could be ensured through stronger election moderation. A few ways eligibility can be enforced is by requiring an account to have a minimum amount of SkyBlock playtime or SkyBlock levels, to have logged into SkyBlock within the past 30 days, and for the account to have retained its current name more than 30 days. Thirdly, all 7 ministers should be eligible to receive a custom perk, not just the top 3. To that end, once a player has served as a minister, they should be ineligible to run in any future elections, giving more players a chance to participate. Reducing the number of elections from 9 to 5 would also streamline the event and make the system more manageable and would keep the event from dragging on. Finally, if Aura is to return, she needs a proper ending. Many players assumed Aura would receive a Dante-like finale, but the admins revised the wiki to suggest that she was a good mayor all along. In my opinion, the admins struggled to give Aura a consistent identity, but I think they can lean into this. They could reveal that Aura's initial arrival was actually a large-scale social experiment designed to earn the trust of the community, with her true evil agenda being revealed during her return. One creative way to execute this would be to have all elected ministers mysteriously disappear, only for the community to discover that they had been imprisoned as part of a plot to eliminate SkyBlock's elite, and the finale could involve the community freeing the ministers. The possibilities are endless. But for now, we wait for Aura's return, uncertain of what it may bring, but hoping it will be better than what it was before.